Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy that you are able to join us for this first installment of the 2020 Community Discussion Series, a partnership between Lippitt House Museum and the Providence League of Women Voters. For this session, we had originally planned to do it in March. That was not possible, to try to keep everyone safe and flatten the curve as best as we could. So we took this opportunity to kind of reimagine what this session could be, and are very happy to offer it today virtually via Zoom. The theme for this discussion is actually inspired by the 100th anniversary this year of the passage of the 19th Amendment. That extended voting rights to women. And we recognize that when the amendment passed in 1920, that those voting rights primarily only apply to white women. And so we know that the struggle for full exercise of adult suffrage is a winding path, and we want to use this community discussion series to talk about some of the barriers to voting that people experience today. So Lippitt House Museum is very happy to make one of the big themes of our programming to promote civic engagement. And we think this now 6-year partnership with the Providence League is a great way to do that for our local community, both here in Providence and around Rhode Island. So this afternoon, I think everyone should have received an email that contained the short biographies for our featured panelists that are going to be speaking with us this evening. They're going to make opening remarks, and then we've left ample time, about half an hour, to take questions and conversations between the panelists and attendees. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. Please submit your questions using that feature, and I will be happy to share them with our panelists. And so thanks again for joining, and I think I'm going to turn things over to our session moderator this evening, Joan with the League of Women Voters.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. In March, when we invited these 3 panelists, the key question was, why don't people vote? We were looking at psychological barriers, senses of alienation. They don't feel part of the body politic. What does government have to do with them? Well, a year later, throw into the mix the pandemic, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and riots. I think that the psychological barriers are not the key problem now. So we have here 3 people to talk about voting in this strange, brave new world and what they see. Let's start with Professor Wendy Schiller, who can give us some kind of national sense of where voting is in this country.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. So really, when we think about voting, we think about how many people are voting versus how many people could vote. So there's the voting age population, and then there's the voting eligible population. And it's really important to point out that, of course, women were excluded from the voting eligible population until the 19th Amendment. So it was, a sea change. Some states had allowed people to vote, but generally speaking, women started voting in much, much bigger numbers, with the exception, of course, of African-American women in the South, who were typically, as most African-Americans, if not all, were denied the right to vote for so many more years beyond the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But the good news, I'm going to start with some good news, is that in 2018, 118 million people, 118.5 million people voted in a midterm election. It wasn't a presidential election, it's a midterm election. That is the largest turnout in a midterm election since 1974, which was the first big election post-Watergate. And it's the second largest turnout since World War II. So when you think about that, you think, okay, what drove the numbers in 2018? Why did so many people get out the door? And the answer is women. I mean, that's the answer. And women from all walks of life, women of all race, background, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and region, women got out the door. And women made a statement. It was a combination of the Me Too movement, of course, and the President Trump's rhetoric or the way that he speaks about women, but also concrete policy decisions, trying to limit access to contraception covered by insurance companies, for example, which is in Obamacare, and appointing 2 Supreme Court justices that are likely to vote to reverse Roe v. Wade in some way, shape, or form. And these things really pushed women to the polls. So an interesting statistic, if you will, of the 2018 elections is that the majority of white women, and these are women of all educational levels and income levels, voted for Donald Trump in 2016, the majority of white women. The majority of college-educated women voted for Hillary Clinton, but all white women voted for Donald Trump. In 2018, the majority of white women who voted for Democratic candidates for the House and Senate. And in some cases, this was the deciding margin in Senate races. Kristen Sinema in Arizona won by a very small margin over another woman, Martha McSally, who was then later appointed to the Senate seat when John McCain passed away, who is now running for re-election. So very razor-thin margins in a lot of places. There was a record number of women elected to the House of Representatives. So the Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker again because the Democrats took the House back. And there's a record number, 127 women in the House and Senate now. It's an all-time high. 89 Democrats and 13 Republicans in that mix. 47 congresswomen of color, the largest in history as a result of the 2018 elections. I just looked at the results from 2012. There were 21 or 22 women of color in the House in 2012. In 2018, 47 women of color elected to the House. And in the Senate, 26 women senators right now, 25 from the 2018 election and 1 who was appointed, Kelly Loeffler in Georgia. So when you think about the advancement of women, and you think, how do women get elected and what do women focus on and who among women, particularly in terms of background, are being elected, there's just a sea change. And I'll leave it to others on the panel to talk more about the role of progressives and the role of young people and the role of women. But women are voting with their feet, literally. There's no reason to expect that that women will not turn out in the same, if not higher numbers in 2020. There are a couple of groups that people are looking at. Black women in particular have the highest demographic turnout of any sort of demographic. 70.2% of African-American women who are registered to vote consistently. This is not just a one-time thing. And overall African-American voting participation went down in 2016 and got slightly back up there in terms of midterm turnout in 2018. But in 2016, the estimates run from 58 to 61%, when in 2008, it was 64%, in 2012, it was 67%. So African-American women are a big driver of that, but African-American voting in general is certainly crucial to any Democratic Party hopes of taking the White House back. So when you think about that, Latino women have always been a group, particularly in Nevada, for example, a state with a fairly high Latino population, which has a majority female legislature now in Nevada. But Latino women are a fascinating group to look at because they are not monolithically Democrats. And Latino turnout is about 47.5%, 48% in presidential years. So when you think about Latino women as a force in American politics, we have to start looking and delving a little deeper on who's voting in the Latino community. Women, and then Latino women are a big force in unions, but there's also a fair number of Latino women who are more conservative socially and are vote Republican. So thinking about the role of women, I like to be optimistic and think, okay, we're getting further and further and further down the road to getting some sort of proportionality between the population size of women and proportion of the population and the proportion of women who are serving at the national level. At the state level, women are also increasing their numbers. And I have a little bit of quick data about that at the state legislative level. In state legislatures, for example, they're 25.5% of state legislatures. They used to be 24%. In terms of people of color in state legislatures, about 18% to 19% of state legislators are people of color, including women. We have a number of state legislators that have women who are state legislative presidents of the Senate or the House. We've seen those women come to the fore in the last couple of years. There aren't as many female governors as there have been in the past. I believe there's only 8 or 9 female governors, and that tends to be more evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. So in terms of, you know, what's at stake in 2020 for women, there's no question that the issue of choice at the local level and reproductive rights is very much embattled in a lot of states. And the Republicans control more state legislatures wholesale, all 3 branches, 3 parts of the state legislature, the House, the Senate, and the governorship, than Democrats, but not by much. It's gotten a little tighter. But if you're thinking of any constitutional amendments from re-emerging for the ratification of the ERA or some sort of abortion codification amendment, you have to think to yourself, can you get anything through the states right now that would change the Constitution? It doesn't look likely to happen because neither party has enough of a majority that could command enough state legislators to vote for a change. So that's something to think about. Certainly looking ahead, the Supreme Court on the issues of reproductive choice is a really vitally important, I would argue, almost crucial to the fate of those embattled rights. And we know that if Donald Trump gets reelected, he will probably have the opportunity to appoint 1 or 2 more Supreme Court justices, which certainly would flip the court on abortion and a whole host of other contraceptive, other issues, rights. And even if Donald Trump loses the presidency and the Senate turns Democratic, most people are expecting, if there's a vacancy after the election, but before January 20th, that they will nominate another Supreme Court justice and get that through the Senate with a lame duck session. So there's a tremendous amount at stake right now. And if that were to happen, then state legislatures would certainly become the battleground at the state level for these kinds of rights. In terms of the suppression of female voting, mail-in ballot, I'll probably end my remarks a little bit on this, mail-in balloting becomes so crucial for empowering and enhancing female turnout, particularly at levels where women are working jobs that they are not a neat fit with polling hours. When you had in-person polling, voting, you had early voting, but you still had to go to the Board of Elections to do it. And not that many people took advantage of excuses required absentee balloting. But now, people who work late night shifts, early morning shifts, 12-hour shifts, and we're talking about home healthcare workers, we're talking about nurses, we're talking about traditionally female occupied professions, among others. You know, they couldn't get to the polls, much less thinking about caring for their families and getting home. And certainly people of low income, if it's bad weather and you have to get off, you know, public transportation, go to a polling place, get back on and go home, we know that suppresses voting. And we know that women are a large part of those who are suppressed that way. Having the opportunity to have an application for a ballot mailed to your home, sending it back, getting the ballot and dropping it off anytime in a drop box, or voting, as Secretary of State and the Board of Elections have worked to do, 20 days before the election anytime. And then, of course, having the right to the option of voting from your home by mail just really, really makes it much easier and much more widespread opportunity for women to vote, and for women in particular of lower income quintiles. And that can certainly change the nature of the outcome of elections this year, not only in Rhode Island, but across the country.
I think I have to stop you, but it's a perfect segue to Angel Tavares, who had fought a battle to do something that sounded so easy. So Angel, you can describe your battle. Oh, you also ran for office, and you can talk about that.
That was a long time ago. I ran against a woman and it didn't turn out well for me. So, let me just say that I am fortunate, first of all, to work. I represent the Rhode Island Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea. I'm here on my as a private citizen, but I am going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done for Secretary Corbea, who I think is just outstanding. So I wanted to put that out there. And I think that we've been very fortunate in our state. I think Governor Raimondo has done a really good job through unprecedented circumstances. And so I've said that before and want to say that again. And what happened in Rhode Island, I wanted to talk a little bit about the recent mail ballot case that made its way all the way up to the US Supreme Court, where we actually got a 6-3 victory. We're pretty excited about that. Well, what happened was that in June, before the June presidential preference primary, Governor Raimondo had issued a executive order basically changing some of the rules and making it easier for people to vote. And she asked the Secretary of State and the Board of Elections, and I want to give a big shout out to the Board of Elections and for their work on this as well, and their counsel, Ray Marcaccio and Santiago Posas. But at that time, one of the things that we did was we suspended the requirement that for mail ballots, you needed to have 2 witnesses or a notary in order to send it in, for the obvious reason that, we're in a pandemic. We want to try to limit the interaction of people, and this made a lot of sense. And the other thing that happened then, the Secretary, with the support of the board, and certainly the support of the governor, mailed out mail ballot applications to every voter, every registered voter in Rhode Island. And lo and behold, turnout went through the roof. First of all, the turnout for this election, even though it was already pretty much decided who the nominees were going to be, was well over 100,000, much better than the previous 2 similar elections, which had like 28,000 and like 35,000 people. For the presidential preference primary, we had well over 100,000. Over 80% of them voted by mail. So it really was almost an all mail election. Obviously, we still had polling places open. And what happened for this primary was, unfortunately, we were not able to get the waiver of the signature requirement for mail ballots or the notary requirement because of the General Assembly was in session, the House passed the bill, the Senate didn't, all sorts of different things. And I think the governor was very respectful of the legislative process, and she didn't issue an executive order. And we were sued by Common Cause and by the League of Women Voters, and by several individual plaintiffs. And fortunately, we were sued. And we went to federal court before Judge McElroy, another outstanding woman, who is now the new judge at the federal court. And basically, the parties agreed to a consent judgment. The secretary was in agreement, as was the board, that we should do away with this requirement, that we felt it was a constitutional violation. And Judge McElroy insisted or told us to work out a consent judgment that would be an order of the court. While we began doing that, the Republicans, specifically the Republican Party of Rhode Island, but really the Republican National Committee, and I say this, that's who intervened. It was the Republican National Committee intervened. The law firm representing the Republican National Committee is the president's, or they represent the president on many different things. They sought to intervene to basically stop us from lessening the restriction. And that's filed. You can look at what they wrote. But they said there's no reason. You can get 2 signatures. You can get a notary. You can do an online notary. The governor didn't issue an executive order. The General Assembly didn't act. We shouldn't do it. So their central argument was we shouldn't be making it easier for people to vote. There's no reason. The law as it stands is fine, and we should just simply enforce it. We disagreed. And Judge McElroy disagreed as well. And she issued a decision saying that in her view, that it was a violation. It would have been a violation of constitutional rights to have that type of burden. And she entered our consent judgment. They quickly appealed to the First Circuit, and we had a 3-judge panel with Judge Roger Thompson was on that panel, a 3-judge panel, who really moved very quickly with the case and heard the case, heard oral argument on a Thursday, and had a decision by Friday. And finding in Rhode Island's favor again, and saying that the state had the right to loosen those restrictions and make it a little bit easier for people to vote. And they quickly then appealed to the US Supreme Court. And we were, and I want to give a big shout out to Michael Field from the Attorney General's office, who took over as counsel of record. We were still involved, but he was counsel of record at the Supreme Court, filing the brief. We defended our position before the Supreme Court. And one of the things that we did was we tried to distinguish, we did this in First Circuit as well, but we distinguished why our case was different from all the other cases, because there had been a big string of cases where the Supreme Court had basically refused to allow changes to election laws. And our case was different because there was no one from the state that was objecting. And that really helped us a lot. The other thing that made our case different was that we had tried this once before in June. And so the status quo was really no witnesses, no notary. And we, so we defended our position. We didn't have an oral argument there, but we put everything in writing. We pretty much knew, or we expected that the decision would be 5-4. And whichever way Chief Justice Roberts went, that the decision would go that way. Our brief was written with Chief Justice Roberts in mind. In fact, the first case we cite and quote is from Chief Justice Roberts. And fortunately, it was 6-3 in our favor. So not only did Chief Justice Roberts, but Justice Kavanaugh as well denied the motion for a stay and pointed out that no state official had objected and that this was in fact the status quo, and began to send a message with that. One of the things people don't know is as soon as our decision came out, the Republican National Committee dropped an appeal in Minnesota. They dropped an appeal in Minnesota after our decision, where they were essentially appealing the same issue. So we're very proud of that. In Pennsylvania, the lawyers in Pennsylvania filed our case as a supplemental support for their positions as well. So Little Rhode Island in many ways had a big impact in terms of what's going on other places. But it really started with the governor, with Secretary Gorbea, with the Board of Elections, which is chaired by a woman as well, with the League of Women Voters, and Common Cause coming forward and challenging us on that issue. Judge McElroy as well. So just coincidentally, that's just to give you a sense of so many of the different women who are involved. And it's been, for me, I'm excited, but I'm worried. I mean, I'm excited about the progress we've made, and I'm proud that we're sending out mail ballots, even as we sit here today, the mail ballot applications, applications. We're sending out mail ballot applications to everyone to make it easier for people to vote. They should be hitting your mailboxes today or tomorrow if they haven't already. And I'm excited about that, but I'm also, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see that in Florida, they've imposed basically what I consider a poll tax, right? So that felons got the right to vote, ex-felons got the right to vote, but you have to pay all your fines before you can vote. And that was decided by the Court of Appeals. That the president, and this is fact again, I mean, you know, I know we're nonpartisan here, but I'm just telling you factually, Republicans across the country are challenging voter access laws. And that's frustrating to me. They're challenging drop boxes, and there's something else that makes it easier. So they don't want any drop boxes. They're trying to put other candidates on the ballot. Kanye West, right? I mean, Kanye on the ballot. And there's a lot of that going on. And so that's really, really frustrating to see. And we've got to continue to battle because to me, I think people vote and some don't vote because sometimes they don't feel their voice is heard. And so I would just say that we can talk about this more later, as my own experience has been when you have good candidates and when you have folks who connect with people, more people are going to come out and vote. I know it certainly happened in my election and when I was running for mayor of Providence. And I see that in many other elections. And I'm sure that Councilwoman Kerwin can talk to you a little bit about that. I just point out as well that the Councilwoman is part of an all-majority or female majority council. So I should point that out as well. So there's a lot of progress to be made, but we have to be very careful because there are many who are trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. And I'm old fashioned. I just believe that you should have a fair election and the person who gets the most votes should win. And so I'm hopeful that we can get more and more people to vote. And I've been proud to play a small role in doing that. Joan, I don't know if I have more time, but I'm happy to yield that to the councilwoman and then we can go and certainly take questions from folks.
It's actually a perfect segue because in last March, when I talked to Kat, the question was, and she talked about it, the almost alienation of disinterest of people in her, particularly people 18 to 24 in her district. Oh, we love you, we love you, we love you. Have you registered to vote? No. And people hadn't voted ever and just didn't see it as salient. So has anything changed? Are your constituents going to vote? Are you getting more people who live in Smith Hill interested in what the city's doing? Because honestly, it isn't just voting for president and senator and governor, it's voting for city council and mayor and state representative. So Kat, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Joan. And wow, the mayor and Wendy are tough acts to follow, but I'll do my best. I think, Joan, you absolutely hit on it. What I've seen in my community, which is obviously such a macro level, I represent a neighborhood in Providence, Ward 12, which is the majority of Smith Hill and then about half of downtown. And that's just under 12,000 constituents. And what I've found is these races with, 10,000 people or up voting, really the reality is, in a lot of cases, only a couple hundred people end up voting. Just last week during the Rhode Island primary election, which obviously, we didn't have contested federal races. It wasn't, the presidential candidates weren't on the ballot, but at my polling place that I vote at, by about 5 p.m., under 100 people had voted. So about 70 people had voted between the hours of 8 and 5, which is just startling. I think it speaks a lot to this disenfranchisement that we've talked about. The reality is, especially in low-income communities, I think unless there's a candidate that is pulling people out and getting people so excited and running on issues, people generally won't turn out. So something that I found too is that although the neighborhood I represent represents a lot of Providence college students, there really weren't any students registered to vote. There's like a 5-block radius of off-campus housing, and I believe when I was knocking doors, I would have, under 10 doors that were people that had voted regularly or were registered to vote. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Something in Rhode Island that we're working on, a campaign that's super exciting, is a Vote 16 campaign. And that's a collaborative effort between Generation Citizen, a group that goes into high schools that don't have civics education and teaches civics education. And so it's Generation Citizen, the Providence Student Union, and some other affiliated groups like Planned Parenthood have gotten on board to work on a campaign to lower the voting age to 16 and 17. And the way that it would be piloted is this would lower the voting age just in municipal elections. And this is really important because 16 and 17-year-olds should be able to vote on who their school board representation is or who is appointing their school board representation, because they have a direct stake every day when they go to school in, what they're learning, and they should be able to vote for the people that are representing them on the school board. This is a campaign that we've been working on for the past 2 years now, and it's an incredibly tough sell. People often are flinching, and their initial gut reaction I've heard is, I don't want my 16-year-old voting. But the reality is, if you get kids voting at 16, you eliminate a lot of major problems that come with 18 to 24-year-olds not voting. So there's data that suggests it fosters habitual voting patterns. So folks later in life, if they've begun voting earlier, will be far more likely to continue voting. It also catches students before they potentially leave for college or leave home. So they've already been registered, they know how to register to vote, they know how to go vote or get those mail ballot applications. And so it's really a good thing. It also, is an incredibly difficult campaign because in most states, municipalities where there may be more youth that are willing to work on this issue and, run campaigns and get the votes on the city council, in municipalities, many of them are preempted from doing this. So here in Rhode Island, we wouldn't be able to, as Providence, do a Vote 16 campaign because it's against the Rhode Island Constitution to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. So it would require, either a constitutional change, which is a whole other issue, or we'd have to vote on the ballot on this question. So that's something that is being worked on. I think it's something that's really exciting and it gets kids excited about issues that impact them. I also wanted to touch a little about mail ballot applications from the other side of things. On the incredible macro level, I think there are a lot of downsides to mail ballot applications, in local and municipal levels races, because I think mail ballots are often weaponized by, the Democratic establishment. And when I say Democratic establishment, the reality is in Rhode Island, we really don't have a two-party system. There hasn't been a Republican elected to the city council in Providence in over 20 years. There's a very small minority of Republicans in our state legislature, whereas Democrats essentially govern the entire state and are very rarely have competitive elections. And so what happens is, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, people in high positions of power are able to hire people that specialize in mail ballots. And what it means is that, they find the win number that they need to win, and they just go out and have people that are hired to do mail ballots for them and get, paid exorbitant amounts of money, tens of thousands of dollars every campaign cycle. And they get these mail ballots from, smaller races. And like I said, the reality is in these municipal, state rep, state senate races, and then council races, 10, 20 votes, that can be it. They're very low turnout. And so when there are these, mail ballot guys, as they're called by different, establishment people that are able to get hired and produce X amount of mail ballots, it really hurts new candidates. It hurts non-traditional candidates that aren't able to, bankroll their own campaign with $10,000. And so I think, obviously at the national level, it's true, we need to have a way for people that can't just show up at the polls to vote. I always think that the best way is we should have a national holiday, working people deserve a day off anyway. We know this, there aren't enough. We're still celebrating victory over Japan Day here in Rhode Island. So it's like, why don't we replace this with something like a day for people to go vote, because it really is so important. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up that kind of double-edged sword that impacts municipal and local races, because I think it's really, really damaging to a lot of non-traditional candidates. But generally speaking, it is difficult to kind of foresee what the future of voting is, because things are so divided right now. And I do hope that we're able to continue to kind of break down these barriers that have prevented people and disenfranchised people for so long, because really voting isn't the only way we're going to change our democracy, because clearly we have so many other structural issues that are really, really huge and massive. But it is a way for people to feel like they're a part of something, and I think it matters a lot.
Okay, thank you. Now we should have questions. I don't know in
Sorry?
Zoom. How are questions going to work, Kathy?
I am going to just audibly say I've been monitoring. And so I think that the first question we have actually has to do with Kat's statement just a couple of minutes ago. The question was, maybe you could elaborate on what you mean by when you said that people get paid to get mail-in ballots. I think there was some confusion about what that role is.
Candidates will hire, political consultants, and their job will be really exclusively to deliver X amount of mail-in ballots. And, a lot of times, whoever is the last person to reach a voter with the mail ballot is going to get that person. Maybe they're like, oh, I didn't know how to vote, and someone's right in front of me with a mail ballot saying I can fill it in right in front of them. And like I said, I think that's a tremendous disadvantage for people who don't have the resources for whatever reason to hire, these political consultants, right? Because they cost a lot of money. And it's just another layer of this like establishment politics that really prevents just like community people who, love their neighborhoods and should be representing their neighborhoods from getting into office. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Can I add one thing on that? The councilwoman makes a very good point. I do think that one thing that's happened though, and that is when mail ballots were kind of rarer, right, more rare, you had people who could do that and have more impact. So that the mail ballots, there are people who might, even I saw this in the South Side. Sometimes people win at the polls, but they lose on mail ballots. I think that you've seen. I think Sam Bell is an example. Senator Bell had more mail ballots, I think, than the president of the Senate. And the president of the Senate had hired someone specifically to do the mail ballots. I think the more that you have mail ballots available to people, or if we go to more like Colorado or Washington, where you have mail ballots for everyone, I think you're going to see that kind of advantage where people who have resources can hire someone to just be focused on mail ballots may not be as great as it once was.
Carrie?
Yes, another question I have here is, given that so many locations are going to allow mail balloting, just like Rhode Island, what do you think will be the consequences of the delay in election results after the general election in November? Is there a danger? Is there a risk?
Wendy?
Well, so I'll leave it. I'll answer that. I just want to go to Councilwoman Kerwin's point. And I think what I'd like to know, and I don't know, is in terms of the Harold Metz seat, for example. I know people who worked on that campaign, and I would be curious to know what percentage of those votes were mail-in and what were actually in person. I think that's a really excellent point, because if you see that in communities that are lower income or communities of color, that you don't have the same kind of mail-in ballot usage, I think you run into a very serious systematic problem. So I think once we learn those patterns this year, I think your point about making sure that people aren't disenfranchised is a good one. But I also think that moving towards the Western system, as Mayor Taveras suggested, it will take care of that if we're allowed to do it. But on this point, so if you go to the National Council of State Legislatures, they have a fantastic website. And anybody can email me, or I'll give it to you, Carrie, to distribute on the website that gives you all of the deadlines. So here's the deal, is that almost nearly every single state, or many states, let me just say, many states, I just counted the other day, 17 states and the District of Columbia allow mail-in ballots to arrive after Election Day. They already have that on the books. It's their law that as long as it's postmarked, you can get it in as one day or up to 2 weeks later beyond Election Day. This has been the status quo. I mean, that's what it is. And there's 4 states that are swing in that category. So it's Nevada, Iowa, North Carolina, and Virginia. So when you think about that, it is true that those states that already have a built-in quote unquote delay could not report their results and could in fact swing the election. But for a lot of other states, I think if they are processing ballots earlier, and maybe Mayor Taveras can talk about this, they're allowed to process the votes, confirm them, validate them, and even put them into the actual electronic counter, then it may not be as delayed by weeks and weeks as people think. It might be just delayed a couple of days. So that's what I'm thinking if you look at the actual laws. But unfortunately, in my opinion, every single state does not allow, well, not unfortunately, every state says you cannot release the count before the polls close or before election day. And some states say you can't even start counting the ballots till the polls close on election day. I get the point that you wouldn't want to release the results, but why you can't start counting before election day is, to me, makes no sense at all.
Yeah, I would just add, look, I think that your question actually, I guess it depends on whether the race is close or not. If the race is not close, I think people will be more receptive. I also think a lot of it will matter as to how the current occupant of the White House deals with having to wait a couple of days for results if it's a close race. But I think the most important thing is to get it right. And we've seen in other places that Arizona this last time, it took a while before those results came out. I remember when Senator Franken was elected in Minnesota, that it took a while, there was a recount there. I think the most important thing is that the will of the people is heard. And what the professor says about counting them, we don't begin to count them in Rhode Island, and certainly that's not the Secretary's purview, and that's the Board of Elections, and I certainly don't want to speak for the board, but they've done an outstanding job of processing them and getting them ready. I mean, they had results this time within 2 days after the primary, full results, which wasn't easy to do. And for November, we expect that it might take a little bit longer because you're going to have more mail ballots, but they've got some machines that count them and also help sort them. National Guard is helping as well. But what we need to do is make sure that we get it right. And, you know, we're so used to, I think now, Twitter to some degree and like instant gratification. It may take a little bit longer. I'm not convinced it's going to take longer in one way, and that is, you know, people make projections even before all the vote is counted. And they're, except for 2000, I think, they're pretty good on these projections. They're very careful, and I'm not a statistician, and I don't know all the different things that they take into account, but my guess would be that you probably will get some projections even before all the vote is counted based on a variety of things. But my hope is, in all honesty, I'm hoping for a landslide, and I think you can guess which direction.
We have another question, but maybe the mayor, we're getting a little feedback, a little crunchy audio. I'm sorry. So I don't know if if you're getting some interference in your house. But we have another question from our attendees, and it has to do with voter turnout. The question has to do on election day. If people know that the weather is bad and we're going to be enforcing social distancing to keep people separated in the polling places, what do you think that might do to voter turnout?
Is that a question? Is that a question about the country or Rhode Island, or both?
He didn't say.
I mean, so this is really interesting. In Rhode Island, we don't know. Things are so flipped around because of COVID. You might expect that people who are older are more traditional in the way that they want to vote, except that we know that even in prior elections with mail-in balloting, that the biggest percentage of people who use mail-in balloting are people over the age of 65. So the other community that is typically disempowered or disenfranchised by bad weather are people who are of lower income, who don't have access to cars, for example, who are working different shifts, as I mentioned earlier. So rain typically deters them from voting, not just in Rhode Island, but across the country. So that's why mail-in balloting is so important, and the 20-day window in Rhode Island that you can vote early. So, I mean, really remember that you can vote early in Rhode Island now for the first time, 20 days in person. So try to get out there and get those votes in. So I think it will have an impact on those who've left their voting to the last minute per se. But this year, I'm not sure we know who they will be.
Kat, do you expect your constituents to go vote early?
Always encourage it. And you send out the mailers and you ask people to vote early. But in my neighborhood, it seems like unless, someone has that like person to person contact with someone that's offering them a mail ballot, it's less likely that they'll vote by mail.
Right. We have another question that I think takes a more national perspective on the, I'll say, the logistics of voting. And the question is, why can't we have a uniform system across the country following successful models such as Colorado's for voting? And I assume they mean, I think if I am correct, I believe that Colorado was an early adapter of mail balloting, mail voting.
I'm leaving that to the mayor and the lawyer. You can go for it.
Thank you. I don't know if the feedback is any better here. I don't have anything near me other than I moved inside. But I think that really it's because the states are allowed to decide which way they want to run their elections. And it's the idea that the states can make those decisions. And you can imagine us trying to impose a national rules on certain things. You're going to have people revolt because they feel they want to do it their way. And it's unfortunate. We certainly, the federal government has moved toward, after the debacle in Florida in 2000, they had moved toward trying to have better equipment, some standards, and make sure that it's that there's a way to verify the accuracy of the voting machines. One of the things I would say to you that I think we should do across the country is say you have to have a paper ballot. The reason that you want a paper ballot is it's a lot easier to verify it. And I get that California has millions of votes and all of that. But the problem with the computers is that they are susceptible. I mean, if they can hack into the Pentagon and stuff like that, you see that all the time, right? I mean, they can hack into computers. And so, it's nice to have the paper ballot. I give the Rhode Island General Assembly a lot of credit. We have a paper ballot in Rhode Island. You all know that, right? You always have to vote using paper. And part of that, it's actually in the law, is so that you can test the accuracy of the machines. And so that I would love to see, because there are some places, and you've heard stories, I know I've seen stories where they push the screen for one and somehow it's registering a vote for another. And so, I'd be happy if we could move that way, but to get us all on the same type of system, I just feel like you're not going to get all 50 states to agree to that. And some people will fight it because they just don't want to be told what to do by, big government or whatever they're calling it now, the deep state, right? This is what I've heard, whatever that is.
All right. We also have a question here for Councilwoman Kerwin. I think the question is getting towards, you were talking about your the 16 program to try to encourage establishing the habit of voting while students are still of high school age. And the question is, how did people come up with that age of 16? Why isn't it 15? Maybe you could elaborate on why that was set as in an effort to lower the voting age for local elections.
So our campaign is a model off of, campaigns that have happened across the country to lower the voting age. I meant to mention that, you know, there are multiple municipalities in Maryland that have established a lower voting age, as well as Massachusetts. And the District of Columbia and San Francisco, both of their councils are just a few votes away. I think probably this year they will be able to pass these pieces of legislation. And I think 16 makes a lot of sense because in most states it's when kids are getting driver's licenses. And so as they're getting these licenses, you know, it's a simultaneous license and registering to vote. And right, that does happen here in Rhode Island. Once you get your license, you are registered to vote, but you cannot vote obviously until you turn 18. So it's that automatic registration that I think makes a lot of sense. And, you know, just like, I guess conceptually, like if a youth is able to take a driving test and able to like get into a homicidal motor vehicle and make, you know, those sort of decisions, you know, why can't they make decisions that also impact their life? Like I said, I think it's really important that high school students are able to vote on their school board representation.
Can I ask a follow-up question of Councilwoman Kerwin? So, and this I wish I knew, but I don't know. I mean, when I was a kid, when I was 17, and then I was turning 18, my senior year of college, I was trying to register people to vote in my high school, and I was originally from New York State, and you could actually register. You could not register before you were 18. So on your 18th birthday, you could, but there was no motor voter yet. So you couldn't register. So I'm just wondering, in Rhode Island, if I'm 17 and I'm going to be 18 before the next election, do I have to wait till I'm 18 or can I register to vote even if I'm not getting a license?
First of all, that you did that when you were 17 is so on brand. That's really funny. Second of all, yeah, you're like automatically basically like queued up to be registered once you get a driver's license. So I don't know exactly if it's either, I think you register when you get the license automatically, and then it's like once you are like of voting age, you don't have to do anything else. It just like happens. Yeah.
You can also, and I just wanted to add, you can also register even if you don't get a driver's license. Rhode Island has pre-registration for 16 and 17 years old, 16 and 17-year-old citizens. So you can actually, not only can you do it if you're automatically when you get a driver's license, but you can also pre-register there. And there are some efforts to do that in schools. I know the Secretary has worked on that as well. So there is a way to do that, and I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Sorry. I had a question for you on something that you said, and I don't know if we have other questions pending, but I was fascinated by something, and you said, I think if I heard you correctly, you said that if there is a opening on the Supreme Court of the United States, I think, that the Senate may try to confirm them during a lame duck session. I actually have heard some senators say that they would, but I've also heard Murkowski say, you know, she has doubts. I have not heard Romney what he would do. I mean, they only need 3 or 4 Republicans not to do it, but I was just curious if you might expand on that, because I know that I pray for the Supreme Court every day, and just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I want to go back to say I'm really glad to hear that 16 and 17-year-olds can register to vote without being tied to a driver's license, obviously, because you think about those children or those teenagers in communities that may not be suburban per se, or may not be able to get driver's ed, or wouldn't be able to register to vote because they don't have a car, they're not getting a license. So it's great that they have that opportunity. It's really important for empowerment. And I just wanted to double down on the political science research shows absolutely that when somebody votes when they're 18 and they vote again when they're, you know, in the next presidential election when they're 22, they vote for the rest of their life. We've had decades of surveys where they will vote forever. So it's really important to socialize them early. To your point, yes, the rumor mill is that if Trump loses or he concedes or whatever, and there is a vacancy, which are two, you know, then the Republicans will aggressively move to put a nomination through. It's not, they'll have to do it quickly. There's a nomination calendar, as you know, it takes a while. Nomination has to sit on the calendar for a little bit, but they have enough time if they stay in session. They can't adjourn the session sine die, which is final adjournment. They have to put the session in recess, which is what I expect them to do. And then they could just get somebody through. They absolutely could do that. And you have to wonder what the margin is for the next election. So if it depends on how well they do in November. But if they keep their seats and they keep 53 to 47, then the expectation is if Trump loses, they would do that, if there's a vacancy.
And just to put the context for some of our attendees in case they're not familiar with it, when Justice Scalia died unexpectedly, they refused, and I'm sure people know this because they're very well informed, but the Republicans led by Mitch McConnell refused to even give Judge Garland a hearing. Even they said it was the last year of the term and we would let the election come first. And then that's ultimately how we ended up with Gorsuch. But I just wanted to point that out. So that was when President Obama was president. I do agree with you one thing. If the Republicans actually retain control of the Senate, that would be interesting in that sense. But I think that they have today's polling came out that even in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham is tied, 48-48, a Quinnipiac poll today. So, yeah, that would be quite a battle.
Well, to Councilwoman Kerwin's point on South Carolina in particular, just to draw the parallels in terms of mail-in balloting and professional organization and voter access. In the African-American community in the South, there's a very large heightened suspicion of mail-in voting. They want to go vote because the tradition of civil rights and being denied in-person voting for so long, and you can speak more about this, Councilwoman Kerwin, but they want to vote in person, and there's a real strong desire for that. And there's an equal force in the South Carolina government that doesn't want them to vote because they're GOP controlled. They expect them to vote Democrat. So South Carolina polling can say one thing, but depending on how they vote and which mechanism they use and who's better at that turnout in that mechanism, I think will make a big difference in races like South Carolina. Just like, I don't know if you want to jump in here on local races, it's going to be very similar. So, but the last national point I'll make is if you're the Republicans and you lose the White House theoretically in 2020, and that's confirmed that you've lost the White House and you lose seats, you're looking to 2022. You're already looking to 2022, the day after the election, to either gain seats back or gain control back. They have a good scenario in 2022. So they have a super strong incentive to their base to get a Supreme Court nominee through to win the Senate back in 2022.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I know I learned some things and different perspectives, and it's always nice to be able to draw on experts in our own community about these big issues. And I think all of us as voters are really thinking a lot about big questions that don't always have simple and clear answers. So thank you so much for agreeing to reschedule our session today so we could actually, even if it's virtually, meet together and talk about these very important ideas. For our attendees, of course, I wouldn't be doing my job as a museum director if I don't promote our next program. And our next program is the second in the series. It's going to be again next Wednesday, September 23rd. And the issue, once again, inspired by the advocacy of the 19th and 20th century suffragists, is criminal justice reform. I was just reading today that Elizabeth Buffum Chase served on the state commission to oversee women's prisons underneath my favorite governor, Governor Henry Lippitt. So this is a long issue that I'm glad that we get to put a 21st century perspective on next week. I'll turn things, I don't know if Joan has any final remarks, but just a wee bit of housekeeping. When we say goodbye, if the panelists just could stay on, we're going to take a photograph. We'll pretend that we're all gathered in person. So I'll leave it for Joan for some closing remarks.
I'm just thrilled to hear that you are so optimistic about a huge turnout. I confess that the the riots, the floods, the hurricanes, the fires, the pandemic has made me wonder whether there will even be polling places. But your buoyant optimism has buoyed my spirits that we will be voting. We will be voting by mail, in person, early, and that the democracy will remain strong. So thank you for this infusion of enthusiasm.